Wife walks in on billionaire husband's affair with baby mama, she's secretly pregnant with quadruplets. The voices reached her first. Low murmurs drifting from the master bedroom, intimate and hushed. Valentina's heart began to race as she approached the slightly ajar door of her own home. Through the gap, golden lamplight spilled across hardwood, and with it, the sound of her world quietly unraveling. She pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Her husband Julian sat on the edge of their bed. Beside him, a woman with auburn hair, her hand resting on a rounded belly that spoke of life growing within. "The baby's been active today," the woman murmured, guiding Julian's hand to her stomach. "Right here, can you feel that? 7 months pregnant. With her husband's child." Valentina stepped into the room. "I wasn't expecting company," she said, her voice steady as morning coffee. Julian shot to his feet, panic flooding his face. "Valentina, this isn't how I wanted you to find out." "How did you want me to find out?" she asked. "At the hospital during delivery? Or when our own children asked why they had a sibling they'd never met?" Julian's face went white. "Our own children?" Valentina's hand moved to her stomach, where her own secret was growing. A secret that would soon prove to be bigger than anyone could imagine. What happened next would test everything she thought she knew about love, betrayal, and the strength she never knew she had. Because sometimes life hits you with the unthinkable, only to reveal something extraordinary was waiting inside you all along. This is that story. If you're ready to witness one of the most shocking transformations you'll ever hear, hit that like button right now. The crystal chandelier in the penthouse foyer had cast fractured rainbows across marble floors just 30 minutes earlier as Valentina Rosewood stepped through the door she'd called home for 6 years. The Hermes bag had slipped from her shoulder, landing with a soft thud beside Italian leather boots that had carried her through another exhausting day of gallery negotiations in Soho. She had pressed her palm against the cool wall, steadying herself as a wave of nausea rolled through her. The third one that day. At 31, Valentina had built her reputation as one of Manhattan's most sought-after art curators. Her gallery represented emerging artists whose work challenged conventional beauty, whose pieces spoke to the soul before they impressed the mind. She could spot talent in a rough sketch, could see the potential in artists others dismissed as too raw, too emotional, too real. But lately, her body felt foreign to her. The fatigue that hit like ocean waves. The morning sickness that struck at odd hours. The tenderness that made her silk blouses feel like sandpaper against her skin. She had been avoiding the obvious truth, buried beneath deadlines and exhibition planning. But tonight something felt different. Tonight, she had planned to surprise her husband. The penthouse stretched before her in muted elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. Sculptures she had carefully selected positioned like silent sentinels. Abstract paintings that had once sparked passionate debates between them late into the night. Everything was exactly as she had left it that morning, yet something felt displaced. Valentina moved through the living space with practiced quiet, her bare feet soundless against heated floors. The scent of sandalwood from the automated diffuser couldn't quite mask something else. A perfume she didn't recognize. Floral and cloying. Something that didn't belong in her carefully curated space. Her heart began to race, not from excitement, but from an instinct she had learned to trust in her professional life. When something didn't belong, you noticed. When a piece was authentic versus reproduction, when an artist was genuine versus performative, when a relationship was real versus fabricated. The voices reached her first. Low murmurs drifting from the master suite, intimate and hushed. Valentina's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, to the secret she had only begun to suspect, as she approached the slightly ajar bedroom door. Through the gap, golden lamplight spilled across hardwood, and with it, the sound of her world quietly unraveling. She pushed the door open just enough to see inside. Her husband, Julian Blackstone. Tech mogul, venture capitalist, the man who had once traced constellations on her bare shoulders while whispering about their future children. He sat on the edge of their bed. Beside him, a woman with auburn hair cascading over shoulders that belonged in Renaissance paintings. Her hand resting on a rounded belly that spoke of life growing within. Valentina's breath caught. Not from shock, but from the devastating recognition of intimacy. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was a relationship, complete with shared glances and the comfortable silence of people who had moved past introductions long ago. "The baby's been active today," the woman murmured, guiding Julian's hand to her stomach. "Right here, can you feel that?" Julian's expression, tender and protective, was everything Valentina remembered from their early years together. Before success had built walls around his heart. Before ambition had replaced affection. This wasn't just an affair. This was a family she had never known existed. How far along now? Julian's voice carried the same gentle tone he had once used when discussing their own future children, back when future still felt like a promise rather than a broken dream. 7 months, the woman replied, her voice soft with contentment. Dr. Martinez says everything looks perfect. 7 months. Valentina's mind raced backward through calendar pages, through business trips and late nights at the office, through all the moments she had attributed to Julian's growing success rather than his growing distance. 7 months meant this had begun long before she had noticed anything amiss. She stepped back from the door, her hand pressed firmly against her own stomach where life was beginning to stir. Though she didn't know it yet, for tiny heartbeats pulsed within her. The irony wasn't lost on her. While she had been falling in love with the possibility of motherhood in secret, her husband had been building an entirely different family. The hardwood beneath her feet creaked, a sound that seemed to echo through the apartment like a gunshot. The voices in the bedroom stilled. Valentina straightened her shoulders, smoothed her charcoal blazer, and pushed the door open fully. "I wasn't expecting company," she said, her voice steady as morning coffee, betraying nothing of the earthquake happening beneath her ribs. Julian shot to his feet, his face cycling through expressions. Guilt, panic, resignation. Before settling on something that looked like relief. The woman, beautiful in an effortless way that made Valentina's carefully curated appearance feel suddenly artificial, clutched a silk robe around herself. Her eyes wide with the recognition that this moment had been inevitable. "Valentina," Julian began, his voice catching on her name like a prayer he had forgotten how to say. She held up one hand, the gesture as graceful as it was final. "Please don't insult me with explanations." The silence that followed was deafening. Through the windows, Manhattan pulsed with its usual rhythm. Horns honking, sirens wailing, the endless percussion of a city that never paused for personal devastation. But in this room, time felt suspended. Valentina's gaze moved from her husband to the woman whose name she didn't know, wouldn't ask for, didn't need. "Congratulations," she said, the word carrying no bitterness, only a profound exhaustion. "You're having his child." "Valentina, please," Julian stepped forward, his hand extended as if he could bridge the chasm that had opened between them with a simple gesture. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out." She tilted her head, studying him with the same analytical eye she brought to evaluating art. When a piece was authentic versus counterfeit, you could always tell by the details. The way light hit the surface. The depth of color. The truth that lived beneath the facade. "How did you want me to find out?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of 6 years of marriage, of shared dreams now revealed as illusions. "At the hospital during delivery? At the christening? Or were you planning to wait until our own children asked why they had a sibling they'd never met?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Julian's face went white. "Our own children?" His voice was barely a whisper. Valentina's hand moved to her stomach again, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. The realization dawned in Julian's eyes. Shock, wonder, and something that might have been devastation. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Long enough," she replied. "Long enough to know that this child, these children, deserve better than growing up in the shadow of your divided loyalty." The woman on the bed shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing for the first time that she had been part of destroying something real. Something that had existed long before she had entered the picture. "Julian," the woman said softly, "maybe I should go." "No," Valentina said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You're carrying his child. This is as much your home as it is mine now. More so, apparently." She turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at the tableau they made. Her husband and his pregnant mistress, caught in a moment that would define all their futures. "I'll have my things moved out by the weekend," she said quietly. "You two can play house without an audience." "Valentina, wait," Julian called out, desperation creeping into his voice. "We need to talk about this. About the baby. About us." She stopped in the doorway but didn't turn around. "There is no us anymore, Julian. There's a mother, a father, and children who deserve better than whatever this has become." As she walked through the apartment one last time, Valentina felt something she hadn't expected. Freedom. The weight of pretending everything was fine, of making excuses for missed dinners and distracted conversations, of loving someone who was already loving someone else. It all lifted from her shoulders like a coat too heavy for the season. In the foyer, she gathered her bag and coat, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She wouldn't run from this moment, wouldn't give it the power to chase her. Instead, she would walk away with the same dignity she had brought to every challenge in her life. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft whisper, and as the numbers descended, Valentina placed both hands over her stomach, where life was growing in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She didn't know about the quadruplets yet. That revelation would come in 3 days, during what she thought would be a routine confirmation appointment. She didn't know that Julian would spend the next month calling, texting, showing up at her gallery with flowers and apologies she would receive with polite indifference. She didn't know that the other woman, whose name was Sophia, would leave him 6 weeks later, claiming she couldn't compete with a ghost. What Valentina knew, as the elevator descended toward the lobby and the rest of her life, was that she had just witnessed the end of her marriage and the beginning of something else entirely. Something that would be hers alone, at least for now. The doorman smiled as she passed, the same warm greeting he had offered for 6 years, unaware that everything had changed between the 35th floor and the ground. Outside, October wind cut through Manhattan's concrete canyons, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and changing seasons. Valentina hailed a taxi and gave the driver her gallery's address. She had work to do, calls to make, a life to rebuild. And somewhere inside her, hearts beat in perfect synchronization, unaware they were about to become the center of a love story more profound than anything she had ever imagined. The next 3 days passed in a blur of legal consultations and practical arrangements. Valentina threw herself into work with an intensity that surprised even her assistant, Maya, who had worked with her for 4 years and thought she had seen every side of her boss's personality. "You know you don't have to prove anything to anyone," Maya said on Thursday afternoon, watching Valentina review contracts for the 3rd time. "You could take some time. Process what happened." Valentina looked up from her desk, her dark eyes sharp with focus. "Processing is a luxury I can't afford right now. I have a gallery to run, artists depending on me, and a life that needs rebuilding." What she didn't say was that work was the only thing keeping her from drowning in the reality of her situation. Single, pregnant, and starting over at 31. The math was simple but the execution felt impossible some days. "Have you heard from Julian?" Maya asked gently. 17 calls, 23 text messages, and 112 roses delivered to my apartment, Valentina replied without looking up from her papers. "I've blocked his number and told the doorman to refuse all deliveries." "And you haven't responded to any of it? What would be the point?" Valentina finally met Maya's concerned gaze. "He made his choice 7 months ago. I'm making mine now." Friday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the city itself was trying to convince its residents that change could be beautiful. Valentina sat in the waiting room of Dr. Sarah Chen's office, her hands folded over her stomach, trying to ignore the couples around her who looked excited rather than terrified about their upcoming appointments. She had chosen Dr. Chen based on reputation and location, but mostly because the office felt calm. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and a staff that seemed to understand that pregnancy could be complicated even when it was wanted. Mrs. Blackstone. A nurse called her name, and Valentina winced. She would need to change that back to her maiden name. Rosewood. It felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Dr. Chen was a petite woman in her 40s with kind eyes and steady hands. She reviewed Valentina's file while the nurse prepared the ultrasound equipment, making small notes in margins that probably meant nothing to anyone but her. "So this is your first pregnancy?" Dr. Chen asked, settling into her chair beside the examination table. "Yes," Valentina replied, then added, "and likely my last." If Dr. Chen was curious about the comment, she didn't show it. "Let's take a look and see how everything is developing." The ultrasound gel was cold against Valentina's skin, and she closed her eyes as Dr. Chen moved the wand across her abdomen. She wasn't sure what she expected to feel in this moment. Joy? Fear? Connection? Instead, she felt numb, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold on a screen. "Well," Dr. Chen said after a few minutes, her voice carrying something Valentina couldn't identify. "This is interesting." Valentina's eyes snapped open. "Is something wrong?" Dr. Chen's face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the dimly lit room. "Nothing's wrong. In fact, everything is extraordinary." She turned the monitor so Valentina could see it clearly. "Valentina, you're carrying quadruplets." The words hit like thunder in a clear sky. Quadruplets. 4 babies. 4 heartbeats. 4 lives growing inside her while she had been navigating divorce papers and depositions, while she had been finding a new apartment and reimagining her entire future. "Are you certain?" Valentina's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Dar." Chen adjusted the ultrasound wand, and suddenly the screen made sense. 4 distinct forms, each with its own heartbeat creating a symphony of life that filled the small room. 2 boys and 2 girls, she announced, her own excitement evident. All developing beautifully. Valentina stared at the screen, tears she hadn't expected sliding down her cheeks. 4 children. Julian's children, yes, but more importantly, hers. Children who would know her voice before they knew the world, who would call her mama before they learned any other word. "This explains the intensity of your symptoms," Dr. Chen continued, printing images from the screen. "Quadruplets are incredibly rare, about 1 in 15 million pregnancies. You're going to need specialized care, a comprehensive support team." As the doctor discussed high-risk pregnancy protocols and a neonatal intensive care unit at Mount Sinai, Valentina's mind wandered to practical concerns. Her 1-bedroom apartment in the village, charming for a single art curator, suddenly seemed impossibly small. Her savings account, carefully managed but hardly boundless, would need to stretch further than she had ever imagined. But beneath the logistical panic, something else bloomed. A fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. These children were hers to protect, to nurture, to love with a wholeness she had never given to anything or anyone before. "Do you have questions?" "Dar." Chen asked gently, perhaps sensing the magnitude of what Valentina was processing. "How soon will I start showing?" Valentina asked. "Significantly, I mean. With quadruplets, probably within the next few weeks. Your body will expand more rapidly than with a single pregnancy." Dr. Chen studied Valentina's face. "Are you concerned about work? About people finding out?" "I run an art gallery," Valentina explained. "My professional reputation is built on being composed, in control. I need to figure out how to navigate this while maintaining that image." "Or," Dr. Chen said with a knowing smile, "you could let people see that strength comes in many forms. That creating life while building a career is perhaps the ultimate act of control." That afternoon, sitting in her apartment with the ultrasound images spread across her coffee table, Valentina made a series of phone calls that would reshape her life. The first was to her mother in Connecticut, whose shriek of joy was audible 3 blocks away. "For babies?" Patricia Rosewood repeated for the 3rd time. "Valentina, honey, are you sure you're ready for this?" "I don't think anyone is ever ready for quadruplets," Valentina replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I'm ready to try." "And Julian? How is he handling the news?" Valentina was quiet for a long moment. "Julian doesn't know yet. He's dealing with his own complicated situation." Patricia didn't push, which was one of the many reasons Valentina loved her mother. The woman had raised 3 daughters largely on her own after Valentina's father died when she was 12, and she understood that sometimes the details mattered less than the support. "I'll be there whenever you need me," Patricia said simply. "4 grandbabies. I never thought I'd be so lucky." The second call was to Maya, who immediately began researching everything from double strollers to childcare options. "We'll need to redesign your office," Maya said, already in planning mode. "Create a space where you can work while the babies nap. And we'll need to hire additional staff for when you're on maternity leave." "Maya," Valentina interrupted gently, "I can't ask you to restructure your entire life around my situation." "You're not asking. I'm offering," Maya replied firmly. "You gave me a chance when no other gallery would even look at my portfolio. You trusted my judgment with artists, with clients, with everything that matters to you professionally. Now let me help with what matters to you personally." The third call was to her lawyer, who assured her that child support for quadruplets would be substantial, but also complex. "Julian's likely to request custody arrangements," the lawyer explained. "With 4 children, the logistics become challenging. You'll want to think about what kind of relationship you want him to have with them." Valentina hadn't considered this aspect. In her mind, the children were hers to protect and nurture. But they were also Julian's, and despite her feelings about his betrayal, she couldn't deny that he had every right to be their father. "I'll need time to think about that," she said. The one call she didn't make was to Julian. Not yet. He deserved to know about his children, but she needed to process this herself first. Needed to understand what it meant for her future, her career, her heart. That evening, as she sat in her small kitchen sipping chamomile tea and staring at the ultrasound images, Valentina felt something she hadn't experienced since the night she walked out of the penthouse. Hope. Not hope for reconciliation or forgiveness or any of the complicated emotions that still surrounded Julian. But hope for herself. For the woman she was becoming. For the mother she would learn to be. For the life she was about to build from scratch, with 4 tiny souls depending on her to get it right. Comment strength if you believe Valentina made the right choice in that moment. Because what happened next would test everything she thought she knew about forgiveness, second chances, and the power of building something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. 2 weeks later, Julian's world began to unravel in ways that mirrored Valentina's, but with none of her grace. Sophia left on a Tuesday morning, her bags packed and waiting by the door when he returned from his morning run. She sat at the kitchen island where he and Valentina had once planned their future together, her hands folded over her swollen belly, her eyes determined but not unkind. "This isn't working," she said without preamble. "You know it, and I know it." Julian stopped in the doorway, still breathing hard from his run, sweat cooling on his skin as he processed what he was seeing. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're in love with a woman who isn't here," Sophia replied, her voice steady. "You have been since the moment she walked out. Maybe even before." Julian moved to the coffee maker, needing something to do with his hands. "That's not fair to you or the baby." "No," Sophia agreed, "it's not. But pretending otherwise isn't fair either." She stood slowly, her hand supporting her lower back in the way pregnant women learn to do instinctively. "I found an apartment in Brooklyn. Close to my sister. I think we'll both be happier." Sophia, wait, Julian said, though he wasn't sure what he wanted to ask her to wait for. The baby needs his father. And he'll have one, she replied. Just not one who's trying to replace someone else. I won't compete with a ghost, Julian. And I won't let our son grow up feeling like he's a consolation prize. After she left, Julian sat in the kitchen for hours, surrounded by the echoes of conversations that had happened in this space with a different woman, in a different life. The apartment felt cavernous and cold, despite the expensive heating system and carefully curated decor. He tried calling Valentina again, knowing she wouldn't answer, but needing to hear her voicemail message just to remember what her voice sounded like when it wasn't sharp with betrayal. You've reached Valentina Rosewood at the Meridian Gallery. Please leave a detailed message and I'll return your call as soon as possible. Rosewood. She had changed back to her maiden name. That night, alone in the bed where everything had started to fall apart, Julian made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He called his assistant and asked for the name of a therapist. Not a career coach or a strategic consultant, but an actual therapist who specialized in men who destroyed their own lives through self-sabotage. Dr. Patricia Lowe had an office in Midtown that was nothing like the sleek corporate spaces Julian was accustomed to. Soft lighting, bookshelves lined with worn volumes, and furniture that invited honesty rather than performance. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and knowing eyes who didn't seem impressed by his success or his money. What brings you here? She asked during their first session. I destroyed the best thing in my life, Julian replied, surprised by how easily the words came. And I need to understand why. Over the following weeks, Julian learned things about himself that were uncomfortable but undeniable. How success had become his identity because vulnerability felt like failure. How he had built walls instead of bridges, not just with Valentina but with everyone who had tried to get close to him. How his affair with Sophia hadn't been about desire but about fear. Fear of what? Dr. Lowe asked. Fear that Valentina would eventually see through all the success and money and find nothing worth staying for, Julian admitted. So I made sure she'd leave before she could choose to. Self-sabotage as control. Yes. It was during his fourth session that Julian finally asked the question that had been haunting him. Do you think it's possible for someone to change? Really change, not just temporarily modify their behavior? Dr. Lowe was quiet for a moment. I think change is possible when someone is willing to do the work, even when it's painful. Even when there's no guarantee of the outcome they want. And if the person you hurt doesn't want to forgive you? If they've moved on? Then you do the work anyway, she replied. Not to win them back, but to become worthy of whatever comes next. Julian left that session with something he hadn't felt in months. Not hope, exactly, but purpose. He couldn't undo what he had done to Valentina, but he could become someone who would never do it again. Meanwhile, across the city, Valentina was learning to navigate her new reality with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else in her life. Her apartment search had led her to a two-bedroom space in a pre-war building near Gramercy Park. It wasn't as luxurious as the penthouse, but it had character. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, and windows that faced east so she could watch the sun rise over the city each morning. The second bedroom would become a nursery, though she still couldn't quite imagine how 4 cribs would fit in the space. At 12 weeks pregnant, her body was beginning to change in ways that made her condition harder to hide. Her usually fitted dresses had been replaced with flowing fabrics that accommodated her expanding waistline. The fatigue was manageable, but the morning sickness seemed to have its own schedule, striking at the most inconvenient moments. Maya had become her unofficial pregnancy coordinator, researching everything from maternity fashion to newborn care, bringing Valentina books and articles and endless cups of ginger tea. Did you know that babies can hear music from inside the womb? Maya announced one afternoon, bursting into Valentina's office with a stack of classical albums. We need to start their cultural education immediately. Valentina smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. For babies, Maya. Do you understand what that means? For different feeding schedules, for sets of diapers, for college funds. It means, Maya replied firmly, that they'll have each other. And they'll have you. And they'll grow up knowing they were wanted and loved from the very beginning. The truth in Maya's words hit Valentina like a physical force. Wanted and loved from the very beginning. Despite the circumstances of their conception, despite the betrayal and heartbreak that surrounded their creation, these children were already the center of her universe. That evening, alone in her new apartment, Valentina placed her hands on her growing belly and spoke to them for the first time. I don't know how I'm going to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to be a mother to one baby, let alone 4. But I promise you this. You will always come first. You will always be safe. And you will always know that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. As if in response, she felt the first flutter of movement. Subtle, like butterflies dancing just beneath her skin. For tiny lives, growing stronger every day, ready to change her world in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in rebuilding a life from the ground up. Valentina threw herself into preparing for the most important exhibition of her career while simultaneously preparing for motherhood ×4. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was curating a show called Metamorphosis, Art as Transformation, while undergoing the most profound transformation of her own life. At 16 weeks pregnant, her condition was becoming impossible to hide. Her usual fitted blazers had been replaced with flowing tunics and tailored maternity wear that somehow made her look more powerful, not less. The glow that people talked about with pregnant women seemed amplified in her case, as if carrying 4 lives had lit something luminous from within. Maya had become her unofficial business partner, handling logistics while Valentina focused on the artistic vision. They worked late into the evenings, surrounded by portfolio images and artist statements, planning every detail of what would either establish Valentina as a force in the New York art world or mark the end of her professional dreams. The Times wants to do a feature on the exhibition, Maya announced one Thursday morning, bringing coffee for herself and herbal tea for Valentina. But they also want to include personal details. About your pregnancy, about the separation. Valentina looked up from the catalog proofs she was reviewing. What did you tell them? That Valentina Rosewood speaks through her work, not through gossip columns, Maya replied with a satisfied smile. But the art critic wants to interview you specifically about the pieces you've chosen. How they reflect themes of rebirth and resilience. Schedule it for next week, Valentina decided. After my 20-week appointment. I'll know more about how the babies are developing, and I can speak more confidently about the future. What she didn't say was that part of her was terrified the interview would somehow reach Julian, that he would see her name in print and it would trigger another wave of attempts at contact. She had successfully avoided him for 6 weeks, but Manhattan was a small island for people in their circles. The Meridian Gallery had never looked more beautiful. Valentina had spent 3 days personally overseeing the installation of each piece, ensuring that the lighting captured every nuance of color and texture. The exhibition featured 12 artists whose work explored transformation through trauma, beauty emerging from destruction, strength discovered in vulnerability. The centerpiece was a massive canvas by Isabella Rivera, a young Puerto Rican artist whose abstract work seemed to pulsate with life. Bold strokes of gold and crimson against deep blues and purples, titled, 4 Hearts, 1 Soul. Valentina had acquired it months ago, before she knew about the Quadruplets, but now it felt prophetic. Opening night arrived with the kind of October evening that made New York feel magical. The gallery buzzed with anticipation as Manhattan's cultural elite began to arrive. Critics, collectors, artists, and socialites moved through the space like pieces in an elegant dance, their conversations creating the perfect soundtrack to an evening that could define Valentina's career. She stood near the Rivera painting, accepting congratulations and engaging in the kind of sophisticated small talk that had once felt natural but now seemed surreal. At 22 weeks pregnant, her belly was impossible to ignore, and she had stopped trying to hide it. Instead, she had embraced it, wearing a midnight blue dress that celebrated her changing shape rather than concealing it. Valentina, a familiar voice said behind her, warm with an accent that had once made her heart race. "You look radiant." She turned slowly, her composure intact despite the shock of seeing him after all these weeks. Julian stood before her in a charcoal suit that made him look less like the corporate executive she had married and more like the graduate student she had fallen in love with 8 years ago. His hair was longer, his face leaner, and there was something different in his eyes. Something that looked like humility. "Julian," she acknowledged, accepting the sparkling cider he offered with steady hands. "Thank you for coming. I wouldn't miss it." His gaze moved to her belly, then back to her face. "You look incredible. Pregnancy suits you." The comment hung between them, loaded with everything unspoken. Around them, gallery guests continued their conversations about art and culture, unaware they were witnessing a reunion months in the making. "Maya told me about the babies," Julian continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "About all 4 of them." Valentina's composure wavered for just a moment. She had asked Maya to keep the details private, but she should have known Julian's persistence would eventually break through any barriers. "Did she also mention that I specifically asked for space?" Valentina replied, her tone neutral but firm. "She did," Julian admitted, stepping closer. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same scent that still lived in sweaters she hadn't had the heart to donate. "But I couldn't stay away anymore. Not after learning that you're carrying my children. Our children." Around them, the sophisticated murmur of opening night continued, but Valentina felt as if they were standing in a bubble of tense silence. "How are you?" he asked, and the question came out rough, as if he had been practicing it. "I'm well," she replied, keeping her voice professional. "The pregnancy is progressing normally. Dr. Chen is optimistic about carrying to 34 weeks, which is considered full term for quadruplets." Julian winced at her clinical tone. "That's not what I meant. It's the only answer I'm prepared to give you." Valentina moved toward the Rivera painting, forcing him to follow if he wanted to continue the conversation. "You made your choice, Julian. I'm making mine. My choice." His voice rose slightly, then dropped again as he remembered their public setting. "Valentina, what happened with Sophia wasn't a choice. It was a mistake that spiraled out of control." She turned to face him fully, her hand resting on her rounded belly in a gesture that had become unconscious. "A 7-month mistake. A mistake you introduced to our bed, our life, our future." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes blazed. "Don't diminish what I saw by calling it a mistake." Julian ran a hand through his hair, the familiar gesture she remembered from their arguments during better times. "You're right. It was more than that. It was me running from something I was too afraid to face." "Which was?" "How much I wanted what we talked about. The family, the children, the future we planned together." His confession came out in a rush. "How terrified I was that I would fail at being the kind of father, the kind of husband you deserved. Sophia was easier. She didn't expect me to be anything more than successful. With you, I had to be human." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Valentina felt the quadruplets shifting inside her, a reminder of the future that no longer included waiting for Julian to overcome his fears. "Where is she now?" Valentina asked quietly. "Gone," Julian replied, his voice carrying something that might have been relief or regret. "She left 6 weeks after you moved out. Said she couldn't compete with someone who wasn't even there anymore." A server approached with canapes, smiling warmly at Valentina's obvious pregnancy. "For the babies," she said, offering selections that Valentina knew were perfectly safe for her condition. Another small kindness in a life that had been full of them since news of her pregnancy had spread through their social circle. After the server moved on, Julian watched the interaction with something like wonder. "Everyone here loves you. They protect you. They respect what I've built," Valentina corrected. "This gallery, this career, it exists because I made it exist. Not because someone gave it to me or allowed it to happen." The distinction seemed to land with physical force. Julian's face showed recognition of something he had perhaps never fully understood about the woman he had married. "I know I have no right to ask," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "but could we talk? Really talk? Not here, not surrounded by all these people, just us." Valentina felt the weight of his request, the gravity of 4 tiny lives growing inside her, the complexity of love that didn't simply vanish because trust had been shattered. Around them, her opening night continued. Her success, her triumph, her carefully orchestrated evening that proved she could thrive without him. But in his eyes, she saw something that hadn't been there during their marriage. Vulnerability. The willingness to be seen without the armor of success and control. "One conversation," she said finally. "But not tonight. Tonight belongs to me." Julian nodded, understanding dismissal when he heard it. "Thank you." As he walked away, disappearing into the crowd of art lovers and collectors, Valentina placed both hands on her belly and felt the quadruplets respond with a series of kicks that made her smile despite everything. Share this video if you know someone who needs to see what rebuilding your life looks like. Because what happened next would show that sometimes the most important conversations happen when you're finally strong enough to have them. 3 days later, they met at a small cafe in the village. The kind of place where conversations could unfold without interruption. Exposed brick walls lined with local artwork, mismatched furniture that invited lingering, and a staff that understood the difference between service and intrusion. Valentina arrived first, choosing a corner table that offered both privacy and easy escape. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold while she waited. At 23 weeks pregnant, every chair felt like a negotiation between comfort and the growing pressure of 4 lives shifting inside her. Her body had become a marvel of expansion, curves appearing where she had never had them before. Julian appeared in the doorway precisely on time, scanning the cafe until his eyes found her. He looked different than he had at the gallery. Less polished, more uncertain. His usual armor of expensive suits had been replaced by dark jeans and a cream cable-knit sweater that made him look younger, more like the graduate student who had once spent hours debating philosophy in places much like this. He slid into the seat across from her, declining the server's offer of coffee. "Thank you for meeting me." Valentina studied his face, noting the shadows under his eyes, the way his hands rested unsteadily on the small table. "You said you wanted to talk. So talk." "I've been seeing a therapist," he began, the admission coming out like a confession. "Dr. Patricia Lowe. She specializes in men who destroy things they love because they don't know how to love them properly." The honesty surprised her. The Julian she had married would never have admitted to needing help, would have solved problems through force of will and strategic thinking. "What does she tell you?" "That I've spent my entire adult life building walls instead of bridges. That success became my identity because vulnerability felt like failure." He leaned forward slightly. "That I sabotaged our marriage before you could leave me." Valentina felt one of the babies press against her ribs. She had started thinking of them individually, though she didn't know their names yet. This one was active, always moving when emotions ran high, as if responding to her elevated heart rate. "And you believe her?" "I do now." Julian's voice carried a weight she had never heard before. Sophia wasn't about desire, Valentina. She was about fear. The fear that you would eventually see through all the success and money and find nothing worth staying for. "So you made sure I would leave?" "Yes." The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way his shoulders sagged. Better to control the ending than wait for it to happen naturally. They sat in silence for a moment, the cafe humming with quiet conversation around them. Somewhere, a jazz playlist provided a soundtrack to their dissolution and possible reconstruction. "For children," Valentina said finally, her hands moving to her belly. "Can you even imagine what that means? For different personalities, for sets of needs, for college educations, for futures to protect." Julian's eyes followed the movement of her hands. Are you afraid? Terrified, she admitted. But not of them. I'm afraid of raising them in a world where the people who are supposed to love them most can't be trusted to stay. The words hit their target. Julian flinched as if she had struck him. I want to be better than that. Wanting isn't enough, Valentina's voice stayed gentle but firm. These children deserve more than good intentions and therapy revelations. They deserve consistency, presence, truth. I know. Julian pulled something from his pocket. A small ultrasound image, worn around the edges as if it had been handled frequently. Maya gave me this. From your 20-week appointment. Valentina recognized the image. The first clear shot Dr. Chen had captured of all 4 babies, their tiny forms visible in the grainy black and white that made them look like constellations in her own private universe. I carry it everywhere, he continued. Not because I think it gives me rights I haven't earned, but because it reminds me what I'm fighting for. Which is the chance to be the father they deserve. The husband you deserved all along. Julian's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The man I should have been before fear made me into something else entirely. Valentina felt tears threatening. Pregnancy hormones mixed with exhaustion mixed with the complicated ache of loving someone who had wounded you. I can't promise you anything. I can't promise forgiveness or reconciliation or even that I'll be able to look at you without remembering what I saw that night. I'm not asking for promises. Julian reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. I'm asking for the chance to prove that people can change, that love can survive even our worst mistakes. And if you can't? If you're the same man 6 months from now, just with better vocabulary from therapy sessions, then you'll know you gave me every opportunity, and you can move forward without guilt. His fingers moved closer to hers, not quite touching. And I'll know I fought for the most important thing I've ever had the privilege to lose. The cafe around them seemed to hold its breath. Valentina looked down at their hands. Hers resting on her belly, his reaching across the small space between them, almost but not quite bridging the gap. One chance, she said finally. Not to fix our marriage. That marriage is over. But to see if we can build something new. Something that puts 4 children first and our own damage second. Julian's eyes closed briefly, relief washing over his features. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Valentina pulled her hands away from the table, creating distance again. Thank me when you've proven you can love without conditions, show up without excuses, and put someone else's needs before your own ego. As she gathered her purse and coat, moving with the careful deliberation of a woman carrying precious cargo, Julian remained seated, watching her prepare to leave. Valentina, he called as she reached the door. She turned back, one hand on her rounded belly, the other on the door handle. I love you, he said simply. I know I don't have the right to say it anymore, but it's the truest thing I know. Valentina looked at him for a long moment, taking in the vulnerability that had never been part of his vocabulary during their marriage. Then learn to love me better, she replied. All of us. The months that followed were a carefully orchestrated dance of boundaries and possibilities. Julian didn't push for more time or deeper access. Instead, he showed up in quiet, meaningful ways that slowly began to rebuild the foundation of trust that had been shattered. When Valentina mentioned needing a new apartment closer to Mount Sinai for when the babies arrived, Julian found one. Not in his name, not as a grand gesture, but through a real estate connection who owed him a favor. A 3-bedroom space in a pre-war building with high ceilings and windows that faced east so she could watch the sunrise each morning. The rent was mysteriously affordable, and when Valentina questioned it, the landlord insisted the previous tenant had paid a year in advance. When the gallery needed additional insurance coverage for high-value pieces, Julian arranged it through his company's corporate policy. No strings attached, no requests for recognition, just practical support that allowed Valentina to focus on what mattered most. Most importantly, when Valentina's doctor recommended bed rest during her final trimester, Julian arranged for the best possible care. A team of nurses, a meal delivery service, and anything else that would ensure the safety of the babies and their mother. He visited twice a week, always announced, never staying longer than an hour. They talked about practical things. Pediatricians, birthing plans, the logistics of caring for 4 newborns. Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild something that resembled friendship. "Have you thought about names?" Julian asked during one of his visits, watching Valentina arrange baby clothes in impossibly small sizes. "I've been reading about mythology," she replied, folding a tiny yellow onesie. "Names that mean strength, courage, wisdom. They're going to need all of those things." "What about family names? Your grandmother's name was Rose, wasn't it?" Valentina paused, surprised that he remembered. "Rose Elena. She was the strongest woman I ever knew. Raised 5 children during the Depression, outlived 2 husbands, and still managed to make the best apple pie on the East Coast." "Maybe one of the girls could be Elena," Julian suggested softly. "And we could call her Ellie." The word "we" hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Valentina didn't correct it, but she didn't embrace it either. "Maybe," she said. At 36 weeks, Dr. Chen decided it was time. The babies were healthy, fully developed, and Valentina's body was showing signs that it had reached its limit. The cesarean was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March, when spring was just beginning to touch the edges of winter in New York. Valentina woke before dawn on the day that would change everything, her hands instinctively moving to her belly where 4 lives waited to enter the world. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the surgery, not of becoming a mother, not even of whatever the future held with Julian. "Today's the day," she whispered to the babies. "Today we finally meet." Julian was waiting in the lobby when she arrived at the hospital, looking more nervous than she had ever seen him. His hands were shaking slightly as he stood to greet her, and she realized with surprise that his fear matched her own. "Are you ready for this?" he asked. "I don't think anyone is ever ready to become the parent of 4 children in one day," Valentina replied. "But I'm ready to try." The surgery went perfectly. At 10:43 a.m., Emma Rose entered the world, followed 2 minutes later by her brother James Alexander. At 10:47, Sophia Grace made her arrival, and finally, at 10:49, Luke Benjamin completed their family. 4 perfect babies, each weighing between 4 and 5 pounds, each with their own distinct cry and personality visible from the moment they opened their eyes. In the recovery room, Valentina held Emma against her chest while Julian cradled James, both of them staring in wonder at the tiny lives they had created. Sophia slept peacefully in her bassinet, while Luke seemed determined to examine every corner of his new world. "They're perfect," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They're absolutely perfect." Valentina looked at him holding their son, saw the transformation that had begun months ago now complete in his face. This wasn't the man who had been too afraid of vulnerability to stay faithful to his marriage. This was someone who had learned to love without conditions, to show up without excuses, to put someone else's needs before his own ego. "Do you want to hold Emma?" she asked softly. Julian's eyes filled with tears as he carefully accepted his daughter, supporting her tiny head with the instinctive care of a natural father. "Hello, beautiful girl," he murmured. "I'm your daddy. And I promise you, I'm going to spend every day of my life earning the right to be here." Over the following weeks, Julian proved that promise in countless small ways. Late-night feedings when Valentina was exhausted. Diaper changes without complaint. Hours spent reading to babies who couldn't yet understand the words but seemed to recognize the love in his voice. He never presumed. Never moved back into her life without invitation. Instead, he built a relationship with each child individually, learning their rhythms, their preferences, their unique ways of demanding attention. 2 months after the babies were born, Valentina found herself watching Julian teach James to smile while Sophia slept against his chest, Emma played on a blanket at his feet, and Luke observed everything with the serious expression that was already his trademark. "You're different," she said suddenly, the observation slipping out before she could stop it. Julian looked up from making ridiculous faces at James. "Different how?" "Present," she replied. "You're completely here, in this moment, with them. You're not thinking about work or calls you need to return or anything except being their father." Julian set James in his bouncy seat and turned his full attention to her. "I learned something in therapy. That love isn't about the big gestures or the perfect moments. It's about showing up consistently for the small ones. For the 3 a.m. feedings and the messy diapers and the ordinary Tuesday afternoons when nothing special is happening except life." Valentina felt something shift in her chest, a wall that had been carefully constructed beginning to crumble. "Is that what you want? A life of ordinary Tuesday afternoons? With you in them?" Julian's voice was soft but certain. "It's all I want." That evening, after the babies were finally settled for what they hoped would be a few hours of sleep, Valentina and Julian sat on her couch, exhausted but content. The apartment smelled of baby lotion and fresh laundry, the soundtrack of their new life provided by 4 tiny souls breathing peacefully in the next room. "I have something for you," Julian said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "It's not a grand gesture. Just something I wanted you to have." Inside was a key. Old brass, ornate, the kind that belonged to jewelry boxes or diaries. "What does it open?" Valentina asked. Julian reached into his other pocket and produced a small wooden box, hand-carved with intricate detail. "It's from that artisan market in Tuscany. The one we went to during our honeymoon." Valentina remembered the trip. 5 days of wine and art and conversation that had convinced her she had married her best friend. She turned the key in the lock and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in cream silk, was a USB drive. 8 years of voice memos, Julian explained. "Every time I wanted to tell you something and didn't. Every time I was proud of you but only said it to myself. Every apology I should have spoken out loud but kept inside because I was too afraid of being vulnerable." Valentina stared at the drive, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. "Julian. I know it doesn't change anything," he said quickly. "I know you can't just delete 8 years of emotional absence because I finally learned how to say what I was thinking. But I wanted you to know that you were heard, even when I was too broken to respond." From the nursery came the soft sound of one of the babies stirring. Emma, probably, who always woke first and seemed to wake her siblings through some mysterious sibling telepathy. "I should go check on them." Valentina started to rise, but Julian gently placed his hand on her arm. "I'll go," he said. "You rest." As she watched him walk toward the nursery, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to navigate midnight feedings and diaper changes, Valentina felt her heart open in ways she had forgotten were possible. From the next room, she heard Julian's soft voice reading a story to whichever baby had awakened, his words carrying love and patience and the kind of presence she had always dreamed of but never quite believed was real. For the first time in almost a year, Valentina allowed herself to imagine a future that included all of them. Not the broken marriage they had before, but something new. Something built on truth instead of fear, on consistent love instead of grand gestures, on the understanding that the most profound transformations happen quietly, one ordinary moment at a time. Sometimes the most beautiful endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Sometimes love requires being broken down completely before it can be rebuilt into something stronger. And sometimes the courage to forgive isn't about forgetting what happened, but about choosing what comes next. If this story inspired you to believe in second chances earned through real change, subscribe for more stories about transformation, resilience, and the power of choosing love over fear. Because the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about imperfect people learning to love better than they ever thought possible. 6 months later, on a perfect Saturday morning in October, Valentina stood in the same gallery where Julian had first approached her during her opening night. But this time, she wasn't alone. Emma slept peacefully in her stroller, while Julian held James and Luke, and Maya cradled Sophia with the pride of a devoted aunt. The new exhibition was titled New Beginnings, Art from Life's Second Chances, featuring artists who had transformed their darkest moments into their most powerful work. It was a reflection of everything Valentina had learned about resilience, about the beauty that could emerge from destruction, about the strength that came not from never falling, but from choosing to rise. Julian approached her as she stood before a new piece by Isabella Rivera, this one titled Love Multiplied. It showed 4 golden hearts connected by silver threads, each one unique but part of a greater whole. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, his free hand reaching for hers. Valentina looked around the gallery filled with friends and colleagues, at the babies who had become the center of their universe, at the man who had learned to love her better than he ever had before. "I'm ready," she said. And for the first time in her life, she meant it completely. The most profound transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in quiet moments of choosing to love differently than we ever have before. Sometimes the greatest strength is found not in walking away, but in staying long enough to build something entirely new from the ashes of what was lost. Love isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about showing up for the ordinary Tuesday afternoons and believing that broken things can become beautiful again, stronger than they ever were before.